Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 16th of October, where we are talking about Edgar Allan Poe, specifically four short stories by Edgar Allan Poe: The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat. And you can see some links below if you don't have access to the edition that I had ordered for class. And you'll remember that our Poe Journal is also due today, if you are watching this on the 6th, at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. But if you need an extension, just please ask me and I'll be happy to grant you one. And at this point, my hope is that you are done reading Edgar Allan Poe and you have begun reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And you can see again in the notes below that I have included a link to that if you don't have the version that I had ordered. I'd say that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is sort of in the in-between space. I think of it as a novella, not quite as long as a novel such as Frankenstein, but certainly longer than a short story, as we've been seeing with Edgar Allan Poe. And I also wanted to draw your attention that this Monday, the 11th, is Indigenous Peoples Day, so we do not have class. So basically, that is a long weekend. I'm hopeful that you're able to use that to catch up with Jekyll and Hyde, and also to begin thinking about possibilities for your first paper. As I was indicating, that first paper is going to be a focused analysis on a particular element within one of the Gothic texts that we happen to be reading. And certainly you can use the journals as a way to sort of try out ideas. In last class, I talked a little bit about some of the conventions of writing papers. And I also addressed the idea of possible paper topics previously in the semester, but I offered you very broad topics so that ultimately you need to create the thesis. So if you aren't necessarily interested on writing about Frankenstein and many of the themes and issues that we had discussed with Frankenstein, you may be interested in writing about Edgar Allan Poe. One of the things about short stories is that they lend themselves nicely to comparing and contrasting. So you could do that, for instance, with two of the short stories, comparing and contrasting, let's say, The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat, if you'd like. But as we are going to be discussing today, there are similarities in all of Poe's short stories, and I think that he definitely has a style of writing that Lovecraft was able to identify as one of the most important in the Gothic genre. And I assigned The Fall of the House of Usher as the first of the four short stories. It's probably the most challenging of the short stories. And when we talk about the House of Usher, we're talking not just about the physical structure of the home, but we're also talking about family. For instance, when we talk about the House of, and then we give a surname that these are the family members. This house is very much, or this story is very much about family lineage and the evil that is passed on from generation to generation. We aren't explicitly told that, it is implied. And the setting is very important, as we've talked about in the Gothic tradition, that it's autumn, which represents descent or fall or decay. That's one of the things that I've always liked about Lovecraft, that even though he writes prose, he has a very poetic writing style. Probably his most famous poem, The Raven, is a great illustration of his abilities in poetry. But even in The Fall of the House of Usher, when we get sentences such as the dull, dark day, notice the alliteration there of the D's repeated over and over again. And of course, D is a letter that also is used with the word death. And definitely death is an issue that is examined in the Gothic tradition. And what we get is a narrator who's alone on horseback. And this sense of isolation, as we've talked about it in other Gothic texts thus far, is something that is usually a negative. And the Usher house is very negative, is very isolated as well. And this is where our narrator meets Roderick. And the idea is that they are childhood friends. This narration is in the first person, so it's quite subjective. There are always strengths and weaknesses with an I narration. And Despite the fact that we are first talked about, or we are first introduced to the idea of the structure of the home, that home is personified. Personification giving human-like characteristics to inanimate objects. For instance, at least on my page 22 of the version of The Fall of the House of Usher that I had assigned, it talked a little bit about the eye-like windows of the home. Eyes are something that Edgar Allan Poe tends to examine in his short stories. The idea is that the eyes are the windows to the soul, if you've ever heard that expression, and also the idea that eyes are capable of seeing the truth. And many of Poe's stories are psychological tales where we basically peel back the facades of civilization to see the ugly reality underneath. And in fact, we're even told in this story that there's sentience of all vegetable things. And again, Poe's language can tend to be rather flowery. Um, Drug references are oftentimes found in Poe, and there's a drug reference here in The Fall of the House of Usher to opium. And I think I shared with you last class that Poe himself struggled with alcohol and drug addiction. In fact, many of Poe's tales sound autobiographical in many respects. What we get is the dropping of the veil and the revealing of the truth about the Ushers. When we find out about the brother and sister who are twins, again, another Gothic motif, this idea of doubling. And if you wanted to think about the house as part of the family, the brother, the sister, and the house form a threesome or a trinity, an important number in Christian tradition when we want to talk about the idea of trinity in terms of religion and also in terms of symbolism. What we get is a story about generational or family evil. We are never specifically told what's going on, but we are able to assume that the brother and sister, the last of their lineage, living in complete and total isolation, have engaged in incest with one another and perhaps maybe the products of incest themselves. There's lots of references to unnatural things in this particular story, unnatural sensations and the acuteness of the senses. And again, one of the reasons why incest is so forbidden and such a taboo in our society is because of all of the biological consequences of not having a gene pool that is diversified. And I think that's referenced in many of the physical ailments that are discussed in this particular text. But we also get psychological ailments. In fact, the mental disorder of hypochondria is definitely referenced in this particular piece. As we get, of course, the Gothic architecture and the decayed trees and the fungi, in addition to the setting, to basically serve as context to what's happening to Roger Usher. In fact, he's even described as having a cadaverousness of complexion. And I always think of that in terms of Frankenstein's creature and how the language seems so eerily similar in that respect. Madeline Usher is supposed to be the deceased twin sister, and of course the twist is that perhaps she was buried alive or she came back to life. There always is a possible, or there usually is, I should say, a possible supernatural explanation in these texts, but also a natural explanation within these texts. And I think I shared with you last class about Poe's fear of being buried alive and how that could be a real possibility during these time periods. That premature burial of Madeline in the family vault. And again, not that unusual for a house with a certain amount, or a family with a certain amount of income and financial resources to have something like a family vault. And the poetic elements in this particular piece continue on, again, at least for me, on page 21, where we actually get some quotation from poetry, where it's in many ways very comparable to the events that are happening within the actual story itself. It's a poem entitled The Haunted Palace. We could say the House of Usher is a kind of haunted palace. And some of the passages, for instance, section 3, wanderers in that happy valley through two luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned law. And then we go on and we find out about a troop of echoes And in the 5th section on page 22, but evil things in robes of sorrow assail the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his house the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of old time entombed. And then the very last stanza, stanza 6. And travelers now within that valley, through the red-lit windows see vast forms that move fantastic glee to a discordant melody, while, like a rapid ghastly river, through the pale door, a hideous throng rush out forever, and laugh, but smile no more. That particular line, at least for me, has always been eerie, to laugh, but not to smile. Um, that's just my own personal perspective about that line, since we all have our own elements that tend to serve to provide more eeriness or fright than others. And if you are aware of Stephen King's writings, you'll know that he oftentimes utilizes many Poe-like techniques in his writing as well. So it isn't just Lovecraft who is a fan of Poe. What we get at the ending of the story is the disintegration of the house, where it collapses upon itself. And the idea is that this is going to be the disintegration of the generational evil, the family lineage. And again, that ambiguous ending of whether or not this is a supernatural occurrence, or if it turns out that there is some sort of element of madness. Madness and insanity is definitely an issue that we see in the Gothic. Definitely we saw that in Frankenstein, where Victor was oftentimes pushed into madness. One might say that the creature was as well. And when we get the very ending of this story, the fall of the House of Usher, when the narrator says, from that chamber and from that mansion I fled aghast. The storm is still abroad in all its wrath, and I found myself crossing the old causeways. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to whence a gleam so unusual could have issued, for the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through the once barely discernible fissure, of which I had spoken as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher. And again, we would need to be able to trust this narrator. This narrator, though, is more trustworthy than the other narrators who oftentimes talk about how they've been accused of insanity, and they try to convince us that they are sane. And in their efforts to convince us that they are sane, what we basically see is insanity. It's further evidence of that. Poe is very fond of that subjective I narrator, as we can see in many of his short stories. But the second short story I had assigned for us, The Mask of Red Death, is a story that I have assigned for many years, and it's only in the last couple or so that that particular story has had particular resonance with our own society with COVID-19, where we are talking about the idea of disease and plague. In this instance, it's described as the Red Death. You might be familiar with the Black Death or the bubonic plague, which decimated a third of Europe. The Red Death is supposed to be something that is associated with the loss of blood. Blood, in at least Christian and religious ideology, is represented as the life force. Of course, blood is also associated with death as well. And here we have a Prince Prospero, and you can see that just from the name Prosperous, who is happy and dauntless and proud. Basically, this is a story of what happens when you have privilege and you try to escape the ills of society, specifically when you try to escape death, which is perhaps something that Victor was trying to do when he was trying to create life from death. And of course, the consequences are significant for doing something like that. Once again, we get a setting of deep seclusion and isolation. We know that that's going to be negative, where these privileged individuals are having a masquerade ball so they can hide from the reality of the disease and the plague that surrounds them. We can read the story literally, but we can also read it figuratively, that the disease and the plague could be any social ill that society is experiencing. But of course, it turns out that in our own time period with the pandemic, we can read this quite literally as well. The atmosphere with all of the Gothic architecture, we're told about the 7 rooms in this particular castle. And 7 also is a very important number in terms of symbolism. The 7 can represent the life cycle with the 7 days of the week or the 7 stages of life. We can also think about 7 in terms of lucky 7 or unlucky 7 in this instance. We can also think about 7 in terms of the deadly sins, that there are 7 deadly sins. And one could argue that the party goers in this story are all have engaged in all 7 deadly sins. Sloth, by being lazy, by basically enjoying themselves rather than trying to better society. Lust, the desire to have everlasting life and to escape death. Gluttony, again, trying to have too much life, and definitely this idea of excess and greed. And envy could be, of course, envying those who don't have illness and disease. And gluttony, again, trying to have an extended life that goes beyond the natural order. Wrath or anger at the idea of disease, and pride. And when we think about pride, this gets us back to something like Frankenstein and hubris and the consequences of that. If we want to think about the 7 life stages, you could think about the idea of an infant, a child, an adolescent, a young adult, an adult, a retirement, and finally, elderly. There's a lot of colors that are referenced in this particular short story as well, and there could be symbolism associated with them. Blue, purple, green, orange, white, and violet. Whether or not you wanted to talk about the idea of these colors perhaps in one way or another being representational for the stages of life or for the 7 deadly sins. But definitely the idea of the black room and the darkness associated with blackness and how black is oftentimes associated with death. And that ebony clock, which is ringing, and basically it puts everyone to a standstill. The idea that our enemy is time, that clock is almost personified in that particular instance. This sense of darkness and decay is definitely seen through the personification of this idea of the Red Death actually appearing, which could be a literal figure, but it could also be symbolic as well, about disease intruding upon what would appear to be their fortress. So it could be a supernatural entity where death itself, in the form of a kind of grim reaper, comes to collect, or it just could be a moral or a message that one can never escape the idea of death, despite one's attempts to do so, and privilege as no way of stopping a very natural life cycle. And regardless of how you want to read this particular piece, I think that this idea of masquerade works so nicely as well, and that oftentimes we try to hide from the truth, and we hide ourselves. And then, of course, part of the Gothic tale, if it's a moral tale, is to express the reality behind the facade. And if you're familiar, I'll reference Stephen King again, specifically The Shining. There is a element in there where at the Overlook Hotel, there seems to be some sort of supernatural event, a kind of masquerade where there's yelling, unmask, unmask. And this is definitely a reference to this particular short story. Perhaps we could think of pride as violet, because purple was oftentimes seen as a royal color. Envy, green, if you've ever heard that you're green with envy. Gluttony, I suppose, could be orange. Lust, a kind of purple or a deep blue. Greed could be white or yellow, or wrath, red, because of the anger associated with it. Sloth, a light blue, but again, I think the color imagery is probably less obvious than the idea of the 7 rooms. Um, and of course, the party goers as well that are trying to escape what cannot be escaped. In this story, we also get alliteration as well. So, for instance, on my page 61, we're told, and darkness and decay had dominion over all. And again, notice all of those D words, which is very Poe-like. And at least the idea of using alliteration is very Poe-like. And then we have 2 short stories that probably are more familiar to the average reader because they're oftentimes read in the junior high school or high school levels. The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat. They both share a good number of similarities. And I think I might have referenced this last class that I believe one of the reasons why Poe is such a popular read at that level is that there's enough of the idea of the forbidden in Poe to capture a younger audience member's attention, but it's also not too explicit or too graphic. And of course, the idea of a short story makes it perhaps a little bit more manageable for younger readers. But when we hear about the Telltale Heart, we've got this I narrator that I was referencing earlier that directly addresses the idea of sanity or insanity. And it's something that we didn't necessarily see with The Fall of the House of Usher with the I narrator. But I think, I'm sorry, with the Telltale Heart with the I narrator. But we will definitely see it in something like The Black Cat, and definitely we will see it in something like The Telltale Heart. And when we begin with The Telltale Heart, we get directly addressed by the narrator. And that oftentimes is a technique in order to involve an audience member or a reader into a tale. And for me, this would be on page 74, where we're told, "True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I have been and I am. But why, will you say, that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the entire story." And Poe often talks about a mind in disease. I think we see that with The Raven as well, if you're familiar with that. And we see the sense of what happens with introspection and suffering and how that's connected with madness and how guilt will ultimately destroy an individual. The first word we get is true, and that's the question, what is the truth? And again, we get reference to eyes, the idea of being able to see the truth. And there is also reference to something called an evil eye in supernatural worlds, the idea of a look or a thought capable of inflicting injury. If you've ever heard of somebody giving you the evil eye, and I think Poe is also working into that tradition. There's reference to the idea of a vulture, which is a bird of prey, and midnight. Again, all of this helps to set our atmosphere. Once again, we get this idea of death being personified. And it's this old man's eye that haunts our narrator, again, because the eye can see maybe the truth of the reality of the evil of this narrator, who maintains that he's sane, but how can a sane man kill and be able to also cover up his crime in the way that this narrator does? What we've got is, even though we don't get details that are macabre, we've got general references that are rather macabre with a dismembered corpse. And we're just told matter-of-factly on page, for me, 76. "First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs." As if that was the most ordinary thing in the world. This is after our narrator ultimately kills the old man. He says because of his eye, after he has spent an inordinate amount of time watching this old man. So this idea of obsession is something that we see in Poe's works as well. The police eventually come. They represent the moral authority. And at first, the narrator is sure that he's convinced them of his innocence. He becomes more and more arrogant. Again, we know the downfall of hubris in the Gothic tradition. I took my visitors all over the house, the police that is. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasure, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. And of course, we've seen this in crime tales as well, is that the need for the perpetrator of the crime to brag, and ultimately that leads to their descent. And we hear that my manner had convinced him, but yet there is this dull, quick ringing sound, a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton, and I gasp for breath. And he believes the officers haven't heard it. I don't know if necessarily that's the case, because we can't necessarily trust this narrator. But then we're told, I raved, I swore, I foamed, I swung the chair upon which I'd been sitting and grated it upon the boards. But the noise arose all over and continued, and it grew louder and louder. Obviously, at this particular point, all of his actions would seem to point to guilt, as he seems to hear, or believes he hears, a beating heart, and says, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. And then the last line, villains. For me, this is page 78. I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here is the beating of his hubris heart. That ambiguous ending, perhaps it happens to be the old man and a supernatural beating of the heart. Perhaps it just happens to be an element of the narrator's guilt, and he exposes himself through his actions. So this could also be an examination into the psychology of guilt, or perhaps both can be occurring at the same time. I always like that explanation, that we've got both psychological and also supernatural explanations and possibilities occurring at the same time. And we'll see that in some other Gothic texts as well. But the telltale heart, this heart indeed just does tell the truth through the narrator and through his actions of murder. And then the black cat having some good similarities to the telltale heart as well. There are lots of associations with black cats in the supernatural world. There definitely is superstitions that are associating black cats with evil. In Egypt, though, cats were viewed as sacred, so that's kind of interesting. And in Europe, actually, it was the white cat that was associated with evil. So we've got, our own supernatural images based on cultural expectations as well as just folklore. Again, we get an I narrator, and this narrator is obviously an alcoholic. Again, it seems somewhat reminiscent of Poe's biography, and how this narrator changes through drink. Drink is the kind of evil that possesses him and turns him into a monstrosity. And what he wants to do is to give a confession before he's going to be executed at the gallows. This is important because at one point he basically hangs the black cat, and it seems that he also is going to be hung for his crimes. The real evil, again, is alcohol and intemperance, the loss of reason that occurs because of it, the meaningless violence that occurs because of it, the self-destruction that occurs because of it. In many ways, this is a story about domestic abuse, beginning first with the animal and then ultimately with the spouse. And this black cat is named Pluto. It was a Roman god of the underworld, or the Lord of Death. So again, you can see how Edgar Allan Poe is trying to use symbolism whenever possible. And it's the black cat's eye that is haunting this particular narrator. Again, there's reference to the idea of the eye, and the eye can see the truth. And ultimately, he needs to try to find a way to reconcile how this beast is able to see the truth that he's trying to keep hidden so desperately. Notice that alcohol is capitalized, by the way, in this particular text, which also gives it this sense of personification. But nevertheless, what we end up getting in this particular story is a second cat after he kills the first. And the second cat is eyeless, and that was reminiscent of the first cat, which he had attacked previously. And whether or not it truly is some sort of a supernatural reincarnated cat, or whether or not it is a kind of doppelganger where we've got a duplicate, or whether or not this eyeless cat with a white splotch. Notice the idea of white, especially when we think about some of the color symbolism of Europe, the white cat being representational of evil, or the yin and the yang, and perhaps that's what we get with this particular cat. But nevertheless, this eyeless cat that ultimately is going to haunt the reader. And what we will see in the Gothic tradition is that you can literally be haunted, but you can also be psychologically haunted as well. Of course, I forgot to mention that the cat is oftentimes seen as a witch's familiar as well. A familiar being an entity, usually an animal being that helps an individual with the casting of spells. We'll never know if this cat is real or some sort of figment of the narrator's imagination, but we do know about the narrator's capability for violence. We're told on page 100 with the first cat, one night returning home, much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town. Notice the use of the word haunt. I fancied the cat avoiding my preference. I seized him when, in his fright of violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fiber of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder while I pen the damnable atrocity. Many times students have told me that this story is the story that has disturbed them the most because of the violence against the cat, that in some ways we become so desensitized through movies and literature and television that when we see violence against another human being, we just rationalize that away as just being acting, but that it's much more difficult to do that with an animal, especially when you think about the innocence that's associated with an animal, since human beings don't have that particular level of vulnerability or innocence, or usually do not have that level of vulnerability and innocence. This idea too that he's being haunted by the cat, there's a fire that goes on, and basically what ends up happening is that he sees this figure of a gigantic cat with a rope about the animal's neck. And he tries to rationalize this. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon alarm of the fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by someone of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. Thus, falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly placed or the freshly spread plaster, lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia of the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it, which I suppose it is possible. It's quite the explanation, though. Of course, Pluto didn't have any white on him, and this second cat had an indefinite splotch of white. But he is just as haunted by the second cat as he is by the first. The wife tries to intervene when there looks to be a moment of violence, and it just turns out that mistakenly he ends up killing his wife instead of killing the cat. My wife called attention to herself, and basically what we're told on page 113, the cat followed me down the stairs and, nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot. And of course, think about the matter-of-fact way murder is discussed here, just like it was discussed in the previous story. And after he's axed his wife, again, it's a brutal thing, but we aren't given the brutal details of the actual axing. He buries his wife in the cellar walls. The idea of the cellar is a place where you can keep secrets. You can view this from a subconscious perspective as well, and that he's trying to subconsciously bury his crime. And of course, it will be something that will be resurrected. Once again, the police are called to represent the moral authority. Once again, we have a very arrogant narrator who's filled with hubris, saying, I delight to have allayed your suspicions. This is a very well-constructed house. These walls are solidly put together. And he goes on, and he becomes more and more suspicious when ultimately it turns out there's a voice from within the tomb, and it turns out to, of course, be the cat, whom he might have buried mistakenly when he was trying to hide his wife's body. Or this could also be a supernatural entity that is exerting its presence. The illusion of closure is given in this piece through the idea of the confession, and also the sense of we can probably never be free from evil once we commit evil. And I think that's something that Poe examines in his particular tales. And we get the ending here. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, this is on page 115 for me, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, notice the reference to eye again, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and notice how he refuses to take responsibility for his actions here, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. So again, whether you want to read this from a symbolic perspective or you want to read this from a literal perspective, or as I like to do, both at the same time, you can definitely see why Poe is considered to be one of the masters within the Gothic tradition. I was curious to know, though, since we were talking about texts that oftentimes we like, it could be interesting to do the opposite, text that we do not like. So that's today's attendance question that is going to be due on Thursday the 7th via our class discussion forum at 8 a.m. And of course, if you need an extension, just let me know. Which Poe story that we've discussed, Fall of the House of Usher, Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, or The Black Cat, did you like the least? And why? So rather than talking about the most, let's talk about the least. So again, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious to see what your thought process happens to be with that. And then what we will do next class is talk a little bit more about writing papers and transition over into our next Gothic tale. If there are any odds and ends with Poe, we can address them then. And then ultimately we can move forward to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which oftentimes is read as a text about drug addiction. So in some ways we can see the parallels with Edgar Allan Poe. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. But do keep in mind that we are not meeting on Monday because Monday is Indigenous Peoples Day. So on the 11th, we are not meeting, and I will post something on Moodle indicating that. So when we next meet, it will be Wednesday of next week when we are talking about our next text in the semester. Take care. Bye-bye.